there. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Ryan Nobles in Washington, where President Trump just returned to the White House after his 5-day visit to Asia, which ended with a meeting with President Xi as the Trump administration looks to ease trade tensions with Beijing. But it's President Trump's announcement just before those high-stakes negotiations that's sending shockwaves, with President Trump ordering the Pentagon to start testing nuclear weapons. The president posting on Truth Social while citing other countries' nuclear weapons testing programs, writing, quote, "I've instructed the Department of War to start testing our nuclear weapons on an equal basis. That process will begin immediately." Later, while speaking to reporters on Air Force One, President Trump doubled down on his desire for the U.S. to resume nuclear testing.
About resuming nuclear testing, what prompted you to do that right before the meeting? Well, that had nothing to do with them. It had to do with others. They seem to all be nuclear testing. Russia? We have more nuclear weapons than anybody. We don't do testing. We've halted it many years ago. But with others doing testing, I think it's appropriate that we do also.
Any details around the testing, sir? Like where, when?
It'll be announced. You know, we have test sites. It'll be announced.
This afternoon at the White House, Vice President Vance was pressed by NBC's Kelly O'Donnell on what exactly the president meant and whether he wants those nuclear tests to include the actual detonations of nuclear warheads. Here's what he said.
I think the president's truth speaks for itself. We have a big arsenal, obviously. The Russians have a large nuclear arsenal. The Chinese have a large nuclear arsenal. Sometimes you've got to test it to make sure that it's functioning and working properly. We've been working very closely, even with nations that we don't have the best relations with, to try to limit nuclear proliferation. The president's going to keep on working on that, but it's an important part of American national security to make sure that this nuclear arsenal we have actually functions properly, and that's part of a testing regime. To be clear, we know that it does work properly, but you got to keep on top of it over time.
Now, the U.S. hasn't tested a nuclear weapon since 1992, after which it agreed to a moratorium on underground nuclear testing. China's last known nuclear test was in 1996. Russia's was in 1990. On his way back from Asia, the president also touted the progress he said he made with President Xi in a meeting which lasted over 90 minutes, saying it was an amazing meeting, and announcing several new announcements, including on trade, tariffs, and rare earth minerals.
How soon do you think you could sign a trade deal with China?
Well, I think pretty soon. We have not too many major stumbling blocks.
What will your new tariff rate on China's goods be once you sign the deal?
Other than what the tariffs remain exactly the same.
55%.
It's about, it was 57, now it's 47.
And how
because
long?
we reduced it by the fentanyl, because I believe they are really taking strong action. We've already seen the action on fentanyl, that they're taking very strong action. So we reduced to 10%. Overall, I guess on the scale from 0 to 10, with 10 being the best, I would say the meeting was at 12.
Joining me now, NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba, NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube, and Gregory Yatsko, a former chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and an NBC News and also NBC News senior business correspondent Christine Romans. Greg, I almost had you working for NBC. Maybe by the end of this, we'll sign you up. Monica, let's start with you. In this order by the president to resume nuclear testing, it seemed to have come out of nowhere. Do we have any background other than what he said on Air Force One as to what prompted this?
We don't, and it was moments before that extremely high-stakes meeting with the president of China that they had really been trying to keep the focus on, and this was certainly an additional layer to that the president said it wasn't about them, it was about others. But it does seem to be some kind of a response to what we saw from Russia earlier in the week when they were testing a nuclear-capable missile, but not a nuclear weapon. And that is the real question here that the president hasn't answered yet, the specificity of what he means by testing nuclear weapons. Is he talking about certain kind of technology that could carry nuclear warheads? Is he talking about something different? Vice President Vance sort of made it clear in that answer to our colleague Kelly O'Donnell that it's whatever he wants to test and that the U.S. has a right to do that if they want to do that. And we have places and kind of talked about it in a more broad, general term. But the specificity of what led the president to post this in that exact moment, we don't have an answer to that. And it only raised way more questions than it did provide any insight or answers when he did that.
And Courtney, the details matter here, right? A nuclear test doesn't necessarily mean they're going to explode something. Well, I mean, what else could it be?
Yeah, so a couple of clues in the Truth Social posting. One, he said that he ordered the Department of Defense to do this. Well, so that, to me, if I'm trying to interpret that, says that this is about the nuclear weapon delivery system, a missile, right? Because that's what DOD tests. They test missiles. Department of Energy would be the one who would be testing an actual nuclear warhead, an explosion. There'd be some DOD component to that, but technically Department of Energy is the one who would be in charge of that. The next thing that makes me wonder that is the word or two other parts, the word immediately in there, saying he's ordered them to immediately. There's no immediacy that's going to happen out of trying to test a nuclear bomb. That would take 18 months, 2 years probably. Just to put it very simply, you got to dig a giant hole to be able to test the bomb in. That's one. The third thing is when he talked about how there were other countries who were doing similar tests. There aren't other countries that are testing nuclear bombs right now. But there are, as Monica mentioned, other countries that test their nuclear weapon delivery system. Again, they're missiles. So to me, that's what it sounds as if the president was saying here. But the reality is, like we know in a lot of these things, he'll say something. People, reporters will try to ask for clarification from people around him, but it really is going to take hearing from the president himself exactly what he meant here, because as of now, everyone who we're asking the questions to is just saying, well, we refer you to the president's Truth Social post.
And sometimes he says things and then doesn't necessarily follow through. But Courtney, do remind us, why don't we do the type of nuclear testing where we're talking about these detonations anymore? Why is that something that's
So there's the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which was signed in 1996. The U.S. has not tested since 1992. And before that, there have been other nations who have tested since then, including North Korea, obviously. But just to put it very simply, you know, it's a potential danger to environment, people, animals, when you test a nuclear weapon, when you test an explosion like this. And so that, in addition to the fact that there was this sort of moratorium that was going to be applied to the entire world, anyone who might have one of these weapons that would just stop this sort of testing. Again, North Korea has tested since then, but it's considered to be taboo, for lack of a better word.
And we're lucky to have a nuclear expert here to answer some of these questions for us, Greg. I mean, so what was your reaction first when you heard this announcement, and then maybe expand a bit on Courtney's point about how long it would take to functionally detonate a weapon like this?
Yeah, it would take some time. I mean, my first reaction was this doesn't make any sense. It's something I would expect the president is going to walk back like he has with, you know, I guess the taco phrase of walking back promises and commitments that he made, because it really doesn't make sense. The Department of Energy would have been the agency to begin testing. And again, there is no immediacy when it comes to testing. We are, since the Clinton administration, required to make sure that we can start a test if we want to in about 24 to 36 months. So that's the time frame that it would take to do something like this.
It doesn't. What Vice President Vance say hold any water that you have to test these weapons every so often just to make sure they still work?
You know, we have an entire agency of the federal government whose responsibility is to make sure that these weapons work. And it's within the Department of Energy. They spend tens of billions of dollars every year and billions of dollars just answering that question, will the weapons work? And the answer always is yes, they will. And, you know, it's important to keep in mind that we don't test partially to keep others from testing. And we have a very extensive catalog of data and these very sophisticated scientific models and computer systems that tell us that our weapons will work. That capability is much better than our adversaries like Russia and China. So if we were to begin testing, and they're not, that would actually be beneficial to them far more than it would be to us.
I'm going to come back to you in a second, Greg, but Courtney, when he talks about wanting to resume nuclear testing, he also says he wants to see denuclearization. I mean, aren't those two things in conflict?
Yeah, that doesn't make sense. It's just like multiple things now in this Truth Social that aren't making sense. And then, unfortunately, when we have the vice president asked about it, even when presidents asked about it on Air Force One, it only muddies the waters even more. Again, I think that what this is going to come down to is someone asking the president very clearly, do you intend to start detonating, as a test, detonating nuclear bombs to test them or not? I think the other big concern here is the potential for nuclear proliferation out of all of this, right? As Greg was saying, that it's part of the reason the U.S. doesn't test is because they're trying to convince other nations not to test as well. But if, in fact, the president were to say he wants to start testing these, well, could there be a potential nuclear arms race? Russia already has more nuclear weapons than the United States does. Not many, but they have more than them. And there are other nuclear powers here, India, Pakistan. what would the potential ramifications be around the world if the U.S. were to start testing like this?
And Greg, do you worry about that too? Another nuclear arms race? I mean, it feels like we're having a Cold War conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the real risks with opening up this can of worms is that other countries then could start to test. And it's especially important for the countries that don't have sophisticated nuclear programs because the tests for them can actually provide a lot of valuable information. And, I think one thing that's important to think as I was looking and trying to make sense of everything that happened here, this is an element of Project 2025. This is something that they put in Project 2025 was a desire to resume testing. So there is certainly an element within the national security space of people who believe that testing is important. But so far, all the scientific consensus and the work of the Department of Energy says we don't need to actually test to know these weapons will work.
Are you suggesting then it's more of a saber-rattling gesture? It's just to demonstrate that we have these weapons and don't mess with us? Would that be the main reason to test at this stage, given all we know about these weapons?
I think that's one explanation. But as I said, that actually would be a net harm to the U.S. because it would then give Russia and China the ability to test. And they gain more from actually testing than we do.
Yeah. OK, let's turn now and talk about trade, Monica. The other news from President his Asia trip, he has these trade agreements with China. It starts with this big threat over tariffs. He seems to have dialed it back a little bit. What do we think, or what can we tell that came out of this that's concrete?
Well, look, I think both sides feel satisfied that there seems to at least be a truce to the trade war at the moment. There's an agreement to sort of pull back from some of the threats of really applying way bigger tariffs and potentially really having this massive battle between the world's two largest economies that could end in, disaster for millions of people economically and financially. Setting that aside and saying, let's continue the conversation. But there wasn't an inked trade deal that actually came out of this. They only basically agreed, let's keep talking. And because the U.S. and President Trump said he was very satisfied with China's answer on trying and attempting to stop the flow of fentanyl into, of course, the chemicals into the drugs that make their way into the U.S., the president said, I will reduce the tariff rate from 57% to 47%, which is still a high tariff rate, but bringing it down to see if the conversations continue. We do know that there will be the purchase of soybeans, which is a really important thing to American farmers and something that is good for the U.S. But there was also a lot in this going into it. We thought maybe there would be some conversation about the TikTok deal being finalized. That's still a question mark. Again, they think they've gotten some agreement from Chinese officials to have U.S. ownership now of the very popular social media platform. But they didn't ink it and they didn't talk about it, according to the president. It didn't come up in their meeting, and neither did Taiwan, apparently, which is, of course, another important issue.
And Christine, let's bring you in. Obviously, there's been so much that the business community has been concerned about in this relationship between the United States and China over trade. Is the sense here that, as Monica pointed out, at least things aren't worse? Do they feel a degree of relief, or were they looking for something a bit more significant and concrete?
Look, this is a real de-escalation in what had been a really troubling relationship even a couple of weeks ago when you had the Treasury Secretary standing there in Washington saying that the Chinese were not negotiating in good faith, name-checking people on the Chinese delegation for not being in the, negotiating in the best interests of both countries and threatening 100% extra tariff. So, yeah, this de-escalation is really important here. But I agree with Monica. There's no signed trade deal here. There's a framework. And I'll just remind you that multiple administrations have faced frustration with how the Chinese negotiate vis-a-vis trade. They talk about frameworks and they talk about stages and phases of implementing an ultimate trade deal, and then they're known for slow walking, stonewalling. I mean, multiple administrations have complained about this, so it's very frustrating because it's in the best interest of the Chinese to move as slowly and very short gains. And the United States would like to see some pretty big, important improvements on fentanyl, on these rare earth minerals. And I'll point out for the business community, there is now a one-year reprieve of these more onerous rare earth mineral export licensing that the Chinese were going to put into place. That means this has to be revisited in a year, which still gives the Chinese a great deal of leverage over all these other parts of the negotiation that are happening, because we know that in a year we're going to be right back here talking about rare earths again.
And maybe this isn't as bad as it was, Christine, but 47% a tariff on Chinese goods, that's still pretty high. I mean, what is that going to mean for U.S. consumers?
I mean, here's the brilliance of the President Donald Trump negotiating strategy, where if you had said 6 months ago that a 47% tariff on China would be the great improvement and the sigh of relief, no one would have ever believed it. We have gone from just up and down and back and forth. And 2 weeks ago, another 100% was threatened, and now we're back to 47%. It puts the U.S. in a good negotiating position, Ryan, because they can put more on, frankly, if they want to, and they've got more that they can take off. And I was speaking with somebody in the administration just a couple weeks ago who said they're really happy with 50. 50 is where they'd like to be, because it just puts maximum pressure on China without really hurting the U.S. economy, and major importers are able to absorb some of it. So in the end, I think the U.S. is where they want to be on those China tariffs. It's all these other things around the China relationship that still need to be worked out.
Okay, create a problem and then solve a problem. It's one way to run a presidential administration. Okay, Christine, Monica, Courtney, Greg, thank you all for being here. We appreciate your expertise. Coming up, day 30 of the government shutdown, and then the escalating fight over food assistance for more than 40 million Americans, with SNAP set to expire in days. Where the negotiations stand next. Plus, one-on-one with New York City mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani. Less than a week to go until Election Day. Could his campaign be a blueprint for Democrats in the midterms, or a liability? You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. It is day 30 of the federal government shutdown, and after a month of deadlock and stalemate, there is still no clear path to reopening the government anytime soon. But there are some fuzzy paths potentially emerging, as lawmakers say talks are happening between rank and file members on both sides of the aisle about trying to end the current mess by focusing on a bigger and broader and hopefully bipartisan appropriations process. But how quickly, if at all, those talks produce any actual concrete agreements remains to be seen, as some senators still couch the talks with blame for the other side.
I actually am seeing some movement. We're seeing more discussions. The Democrats I talk to are exasperated themselves and see no real benefit politically or otherwise.
There are conversations ongoing, as there have been from the beginning of the shutdown, but the talks will go nowhere if Republicans remain completely intransigent and resistant to any compromise on extending the health care coverage.
And as the shutdown continues, the country is barreling toward a food assistance cliff for tens of millions of Americans, with funding for SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, set to lapse for the first time in the program's history in just 2 days. Yesterday, a Democratic standalone bill to fund the program was blocked in the Senate as Democrats slammed Republicans and the president for not taking action.
Trump is telling 15 million hungry children, eat dirt. Trump is telling 1 million hungry vets, eat dirt. Trump is telling 8 million seniors who are hungry, eat dirt.
He is prepared to let millions and millions of children and their parents and grandchildren go hungry because he sees maybe there is a political gain.
This moment isn't just an economic failure. This isn't just a civic failure. This is an utter moral failure for the Trump administration and MAGA Republicans.
More than 40 million Americans rely on SNAP, and at least 10% of the population in 33 states receive benefits through the program. Today, a Boston court heard a lawsuit from Democrat-led states and D.C. seeking to compel the administration to use USDA contingency funds to keep the program running, setting another hearing for next month. Meanwhile, Republicans pushing back on standalone measures, saying that funding for SNAP, as well as pay for federal workers, can be resolved easily by passing the Republicans' short-term funding bill.
The SNAP bill that they tried to use yesterday was not just a cynical political ploy to insulate themselves from the consequences of their own actions. It was also a disturbing signal. The Democrats are ready to continue this shutdown, I guess forever.
The simplest way to end the pain and the simplest way to make this stop is for the Democrats to do the obvious and right thing and vote for the nonpartisan funding measure so that we can turn everything back on.
Joining me now from Capitol Hill is senior national political reporter Sahil Kapoor. So let's start, Sahil, with this potential path out of the shutdown. Who's talking and how seriously are they talking?
Well, Ryan, let's start first with who isn't talking, and that is the leaders of the two parties, which is simply the main reason the shutdown has gone on this long. Democrats are demanding a negotiation where they have some of their demands met, and Republican leaders say there is nothing to negotiate. They are taking a principled opposition to having this four corners, high-level discussion, which a lot of their rank and file dislike. They view this as, shady deals and smoke-filled back rooms. Who are talking are the rank and members. There are a couple of different threads going on here. The first is conversations about a solution with health care that centers largely around Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen, who's an appropriator, also the author of an ACA funding extension. These talks keep hitting a wall because Republican leaders and President Trump are not willing to promise anything in the context of this government funding bill. They say that is a negotiation that can only happen once the government is reopened. The somewhat more promising bipartisan chatter among rank-and-file members is about the appropriations process. There's some talk among members of both parties that they could use existing vehicles sent by the House, hollow them out, and put appropriations bills on them. It's just a complicated procedural way of saying, Ryan, that they could find a path to negotiating on full-year funding bills, which gives both parties a way to say they got something. The Republicans can say they held to their position, which is that the only negotiations can happen on appropriations bills, and Democrats can point to the contents of those appropriations bills to say, here's what we won.
And what's our vibe here? Is it how much outside pressure is driving the desire for a deal, or perhaps driving a desire for both sides to hold firm?
There is a lot of outside pressure, but it's not enough to move either party, for the simple reason that, yes, the polls show Democrats are being blamed a little bit less than Republicans and Trump, but Republicans aren't moved by that because it's not a massive margin. Democrats also feel very comfortable with the politics of the healthcare fight that they're waging. The subsidies that they're trying to extend are very popular and would affect voters all over the country negatively if they were to expire. And Republicans are largely following President Trump and the White House here, which has taken on a political war posture right from the start. They don't want to deal with Democrats at all on this. The way they've been operating, it's almost as though they think it's beneath them to have a negotiation with the party out of power that they just beat. So I don't see any white smoke on that front.
And Sahil, I'm sure you get this question more than any other question, just like I do. What's the timeline? When could this shutdown end, especially when we talk about these deadlines for things like food assistance?
The truth is nobody knows, Ryan, as you and I have told people, who have asked us when this is going to end. But I do think in the next few days, the pain is about to reach a whole other level. On November 1st, as you just mentioned, the SNAP benefits for more than 40 million Americans expire. The sticker shock of ACA premium hikes is about to get real, with open enrollment starting on the same day on November 1st, and paychecks being missed by thousands of federal workers all over the country, including TSA agents and air traffic controllers. That was the sort of thing that that ended the last shutdown in 2019. So stay tuned. It could matter.
We know this for sure. The Senate and the House are not in session this entire weekend, so it's certain to go into a sixth week and come very close, if not eclipsing the previous record. All right, Sahil Kapoor, thank you for that. And with federal food assistance set to run out this weekend, states are trying to address the shortfall. Joining me now is the Virginia Secretary of Health and Human Resources, Janet Kelly. Secretary Kelly, thanks for being here. Earlier this week, you, along with Governor Glenn Youngkin, announced that Virginia will issue its own food aid program to temporarily replace SNAP if it lapses. How will this program work, and where are you getting the money to pay for it?
Well, we have created a parallel system to the SNAP program at the federal level. Here in Virginia, we are using emergency funds. The governor declared a state of emergency last week, which allowed us to tap into funds that we would normally use for a natural disaster. Keep in mind, Virginia has a surplus. That's not the case at the federal level. And so we're using something called Sum Sufficient that we would normally use for that. We're using it for this parallel program, and we're going to ensure that Virginians have the benefits that they need so that they're not blindsided and so that they can access those funds very similarly to how they access SNAP funds. It's called the Virginia Emergency Nutrition Assistance Effort.
But I imagine that even that has a time limit, right? You can't pull from this surplus that the state has built for too long, can you?
Yes, it's $37.5 million a week, Ryan. And so, yeah, we need the shutdown to end so that we can preserve taxpayer dollars, whether they're federal or state. And we would love to gently encourage our senators, Kane and Warner. They only need a handful of senators to get us across the finish line to end the shutdown. And we're really hoping that they will step up and reopen the federal government.
All right. Talk to me, though, about what it's like to start a program like this from scratch, especially when you didn't see the problem coming.
Yeah, it wasn't easy at all. It was quite a challenge, but thanks to Governor Youngkin's leadership, the governor's office proper here that spent a lot of elbow grease on this, and our wonderful state agency, the Virginia Department of Social Services, we were able to turn something around fairly quickly. We had the existing infrastructure from a different program that we were able to lay this on top of. So that reduced what should have generally taken weeks or months to several days. And we're going to have this up and running on Monday, the 3rd. And we're just very, very grateful and pleased that we can offer this solution to Virginians.
And Virginia, of course, unique in that it has one of the largest shares of federal workers in the country. Many of them are furloughed or working without paychecks right now. Does that put an additional strain on the need for food assistance in general in the Commonwealth? And how is your government dealing with that?
Well, in addition to this parallel program called VINA, we have invested over $1 million in our Food Bank Federation. So even if you weren't previously qualified for SNAP and therefore can take advantage of this program, you can access those extra funds through the food bank. And we've got some other contingency plans that are coming next week that we hope to announce then to help anyone else who needs that extra assistance. But again, we're hoping that the shutdown will end quickly so that we don't need to use these contingency plans.
And how are you communicating these changes to those who are set to lose their SNAP assistant? Is it automatically going to take effect? Do they have to sign up for something? How is it that someone who is going to be in this, caught up in this shutdown, will need this assistance? How can they take advantage of this new program?
Well, the governor held a press conference just yesterday on the program to announce it to press outlets across the Commonwealth. He also, we're sending out text messages to everyone on file that we have information for and telling them directly what is going to happen to set those expectations. We're getting the word out through the media, but we do need to draw attention to one big difference in this program than the SNAP program. The SNAP program is allotted monthly. This program will be allotted weekly, again, to be good financial stewards of Virginia tax dollars.
Yeah, and I have to imagine, though, based on all of this still, you have to be concerned that there are still going to be some people that fall through the cracks. How does that keep you up at night as you're dealing with this problem?
About 12,000 Virginians are added to the SNAP rolls every month. And so we think that we can serve them well through the food bank efforts. If that becomes not the case, then of course we will pivot. As you've seen, our governor is a problem solver. He came up with this creative and courageous solution. And I am sure that we will be in a position to be able to help those workers if they need it next month.
Okay. Secretary Janet Kelly, you've got an enormous responsibility on your plate. Please tell all my friends in Richmond I said hello and thank you for joining us.
Will do. Thank you, Ryan.
All right. Up next, Zohran Mamdani meets the press. The ascendant Democratic Socialist speaks to NBC News just days before Election Day as Republicans look to tie him to Democrats nationally, and his new polls show him with a double-digit lead in the high-stakes mayor's race. Keep it here on Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. With just 5 days to go until Election Day, a new poll shows that Democratic Socialist Zohran Mamdani has a significant lead in the race for New York City mayor. Mamdani, the Democratic nominee, leads Andrew Cuomo, who's running as an independent, by 25 percentage points in the new Emerson College poll. Republican Curtis Sliwa is a distant third. My colleague, NBC's Alan Smith, spoke to Mamdani just moments ago.
What about this job scares you?
I think what scares me in this moment is the prospect of Donald Trump's puppet becoming the one who would hold it. And that's what we find in Andrew Cuomo, a man who knows he has a narrow path to City Hall and has taken that to mean that he should fund it and pave it with the money from Donald Trump's billionaire donors. I am very excited at the prospect of winning this race, but I will never let our confidence become complacency. And so every single day, I remind myself, I remind our supporters, I remind our team of the fact that this is an election to be won. It's not one that will ever be given to us.
NBC News correspondent Sam Brock joins me now with more on Mamdani's campaign and what the term Democratic Socialist really means. Sam, I followed Bernie Sanders around the country for a year and a half, so I learned a lot about Democratic Socialism. But you tell me what you've learned.
Sure. So he was sort of the godfather, if you will, back in 2016, Ryan. But yeah, they consider themselves an organization of organizers, which is to say they're not necessarily aligned with Democrats. They're not necessarily aligned with progressives, but rather a group of people on a mission to effectuate change for working class families. And if Zohran Mamdani does get the New York City mayoralty on Tuesday, it becomes the biggest executive office, Ryan, that this group so far has attained.
In front of a roaring crowd in Queens, New York, the three political figures most associated with democratic socialism, Senator Bernie Sanders.
This country belongs to us, not them.
Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
We are a working people's borough in a working people's city.
And Zohran Mamdani, seen as a possible standard bearer for the movement and the favorite to be New York City's next mayor.
We won by 13%, with the most votes in any citywide primary in New York City history.
Supporters have a good sense of what drives democratic socialism.
For me, being a democratic socialist is wanting and guaranteeing dignity for all people.
The best way to make New York a successful city is to end the policies that have turned it into a playground for the rich.
But the question of what defines DSA, or the Democratic Socialists of America, has become a point of much conjecture, with former Governor Andrew Cuomo crushed by Mamdani in the Democratic primary, trying to use it as a cudgel in his independent bid.
Zohran is not a Democrat. Democratic Socialist is a different thing.
And President Trump fiercely criticizing the 34-year-old's candidacy, falsely calling him a communist.
I wouldn't be generous to a communist, a guy that's going to take the money and throw it out the window.
Do you think that billionaires have a right to exist?
I don't think that we should have billionaires.
Mamdani, in an interview on Meet the Press, framing the movement as a fight for economic justice.
Call it democracy or call it democratic socialism, there has to be a better distribution of wealth for all of God's children in this country.
For perspective, we sat down with Kareem El-Rafai, who sits on DSA's National Political Committee.
Everybody has the right to a roof over their head, and that, everybody has the right to a living wage.
El-Rafai says DSA sprang up with Sanders' push for Medicare for All in 2016. Now crescendoing with this campaign around affordability.
I will freeze the rent. I won't defund the police.
The centerpiece of Mamdani's pitch to voters: buses, some city-owned groceries, rent freeze for 1 million rent-stabilized units, and a universal child care program he says he'd pay for with a 2% tax on millionaires and raising the corporate tax rate to match New Jersey's. Proposals that have sparked fears wealthy New Yorkers will flee the city.
We've raised taxes on the rich in the past, and they haven't all left.
So you don't buy the idea that people are going to flee as a result of higher taxes?
I don't.
It's also a movement about solidarity with Palestinians, supporting the nonviolent boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which critics call anti-Israel. Some Mamdani comments on the issue getting backlash, like at first declining to say whether Hamas should lay down arms in an interview with Fox News before pivoting on the debate stage.
Of course, I believe that they should lay down their arms.
How does DSA see Hamas? What does the organization think about Hamas?
Admittedly, it is a somewhat frustrating question to get asked. This has been, I think, one of the most Islamophobic campaigns in recent memory. DSA has committed itself to nonviolence consistently.
The big question, does the New York mayoral race mean something more for national politics?
Is it realistic to think that the DSA is the counterpunch to Trump and to MAGA worlds and is going to be successful in places beyond New York City?
That's the beauty of our movement, is that it's bigger than just one person.
Political analyst Hank Scheinkoff, who's consulted on more than 700 campaigns, says the traditional Democratic Party has already fractured.
This is the beginning of the end of the Democratic Party as we know it. If it survives, it will transfer into something else.
What that something might be appears to be rapidly picking up steam on America's biggest stage.
We will make our city one where every person who calls it home can live a dignified life.
Sam, I cover Capitol Hill. There's a lot of prominent Democrats there who have kind of put Zohran Mamdani at an arm's length. Hakeem Jeffries just endorsed him. The New York governor, Kathy Hochul, endorsed him. It wasn't until just recently. But we still have not heard from Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. He has yet to say if he's going to endorse him. What is his relationship like with establishment Democrats? And does the establishment have real concerns about him, especially how he could be used against them in the upcoming midterms?
It certainly feels like that's a valid question. And Ryan, it's sort of the question right now for the Democratic Party is wrestling what the base wants with what could potentially be viable outside of New York City and certainly for the midterm elections a year from now. You mentioned Governor Hochul. That was the big first institutional chip to fall in terms of supporting Zohran Mamdani. She did so, by the way, on the basis of affordability. She said that they could work together on those issues. And definitely she is a big supporter of universal child care. And that is something they've talked about working together on. But Hochul still says she doesn't want to raise taxes, which sort of puts her at odds with Mamdani. There is also the moment you mentioned with Hakeem Jeffries only a few days ago, coming out sort of an arm's-length endorsement. He basically said this was a free and fair primary. Mamdani won clearly, and we need to coalesce now around an existential threat, which is President Trump. But he didn't say, I'm embracing Mamdani's policies. As far as the other figures you mentioned, Senator Schumer hasn't weighed in yet. Neither has Senator Gillibrand. And you have Tom Suozzi and figures like him, swing district congressmen who have come out and actually endorsed Cuomo. It does tell you right now that there is concern about the DSA potentially being polarizing, but all of the energy right now appears to be with the DSA and the base. And again, that's the contradiction the party is trying to figure out.
It's not an exact comparison, but I seem to remember the Republican Party going through a similar existential crisis with a fellow by the name of Donald Trump, and we saw how that turned out. So, Sam Brock, thank you for that report. Excellent work. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Ryan.
Don't forget to tune into our NBC News special election night coverage this Tuesday. Join Tom Yamas, Kristen Welker, Hallie Jackson, and Steve Kornacki. They'll bring you all the results and analysis. You might even see me on that night, too. It all starts at 7 p.m. Eastern, streaming on NBC News Now. After the break, President Trump's latest escalation against his perceived political enemies. The panel is next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Zohran Mamdani is running for mayor of New York, but Republicans nationwide are trying to make him the face of the Democratic Party. Here's House Speaker Mike Johnson earlier today.
I think Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries are irredeemable at this point. I don't think they'll be able to tell Mamdani in New York and his disciples that they voted to open the government. Hakeem Jeffries is terrified that Mamdani, one of his disciples, is going to challenge him in his own seat in the election next fall. You've already seen that rumored. Some of you have reported on it. So he had to do it. He had to endorse socialism. He had to endorse Marxism. This dangerous ideology that has taken over the Democrat Party. That is what is motivating them.
I'm joined now by Dan Merica, the co-anchor of the Washington Post's Early Brief newsletter, Amisha Cross, a Democratic strategist and former Obama campaign advisor, and Republican strategist Malik Abdul. So, Dan, let's start with you. It's interesting that Republicans are so scared that the mayor of New York City is going to become some big national figure, because I feel like that office there's a long line of candidates who
deja vu all over again.
But also didn't get much further than the New York City mayor's office. Bill de Blasio would like you to call him. But is he the future of the Democratic Party? Is this the guy, the next big star of the Democratic Party?
I feel like we do this every 4 years, that the mayor of New York, it's an off-year election, so it gets a lot of attention that it probably wouldn't get if it was in a more normal election cycle. Republicans are going to find a cudgel. If it wasn't Mamdani, it would be somebody else, and they'd find somebody else. And of course, New York's a big city. It's an important city, and it gets a lot of attention. But I do think that it can be overblown, the role that the New York mayor can play in national politics. Just as I think it's sometimes easy when you look at a race. Voters are often not complicated. They can look at a race and maybe not vote on an issue, or maybe not look at one thing and just kind of look at vibes in general. They might know he's a Democratic Socialist. They might not. They might see him on the subway talking to the subway takes guy, or talking on Instagram about music from New York that he likes. And so it's not that voters are flocking to him strictly because of his background and his DSA background, but it might just be because he, meets them where they at, and he's good at this.
Yeah. I mean, let's talk about that, Amisha. Because he might be, Dan makes a good point about where New York City mayors end up after winning this office. But there does seem to be a little bit of different energy behind this campaign that maybe we haven't seen in past Democratic campaigns in New York City. Is he ultimately good for the Democratic Party?
I think that he's ultimately good in terms of messaging. He has had a way of making a quake across multiple demographics. He has a very strong, understanding of social media and how to engage there, but he also meets people where they are. The name of the game this election cycle has been affordability. I would argue is the name game in the presidential in the last election as well, and Democrats kind of lost the ball on that. What Mamdani has done was made affordability the central focus, talked about the housing prices, talked about the cost of groceries, made kitchen table issues the main focus of his campaign, irrespective of them trying to move the needle time and time again about him being somebody who's of the Islamic faith, being somebody who obviously is of a different demographic than what we've seen in New York mayors. At the end of the day, this is a guy who made the proof point the proof point. It was meeting people where they are. They care about being able to afford housing in New York. They care about being able to put food in the table in New York. They care about these things nationally as well. So if Democrats can take anything from him, it's talk about the things that matter to voters the most, and those voters will show up.
Okay, but Malik, on the other side, Republicans view him as a threat. They've decided to make him his boogeyman. They're talking about him in places like Iowa, in Arkansas, and Nebraska. Is that drawing so much attention to him, giving him such a platform? Could that backfire?
So I don't think that Republicans actually see him as a threat. I see him, much like Dan said, somebody has to be the boogeyman. And before then, it was AOC. It was Jasmine Crockett. It was Brandon Johnson in Chicago. I think right now he's about at 31%. It was Bill de Blasio. So this is something really that both sides do. You know, you kind of pick the worst, what is at least assumed to be the worst figure in the party, and say, well, this is representative of the entire party. I think the challenge that he has is that there are things that he said in the past that has caused people to question what he will do in office. But there is an effort by Republicans that I push back against it. You know, Sliwa is running for the mayor's seat, and I think that Republicans, instead of focusing on trying to get him out of the race, they should say, well, you know what? If New York votes for him, that is New York City, much like it was Chicago, much like it was Baltimore, much like it was here in D.C. This effort to kind of push Sliwa out of the race, or at least ignore him, I don't think this is something that Republicans should be doing.
But let me ask you separately about this, and you're right. You know, placing him as a boogeyman, it's an easy target, easy to point at. That's a similar script to what Democrats ran with Donald Trump back in 2016, right? But they gave him so much attention, and they downplayed the other opponents in favor of him, and he just seemed to get fuel from that, and his movement continued to grow. And you see a degree of that with Mamdani. Isn't there a risk here that they are giving him a platform that he could take advantage of?
Well, I think being the mayor of New York already gives him a very huge platform. And to piggyback off of what Amicia was saying, you have to give him credit for talking about the things that people actually care about in a very direct way. So he talks about the affordability crisis. You know, Republicans, obviously, we mock what he wants to do around grocery stores and things like that. But these are real concerns. And so that economic anxiety, to Amicia's point, the economic anxiety that elected Donald Trump in 2024, that will be on the ballot across the country on Tuesday.
Okay, let's talk now about the shutdown. It feels, Dan, like we're in a holding pattern. I don't see any sort of big breakthrough here. Are we going to break a record?
I mean, it seems like that we're going to break a record. This weekend will be really fascinating in a negative way, in the way that SNAP could be affected, Head Start could be affected. You have open enrollment, so you have folks who want health care who are going to see their prices, I think we reported at the Washington Post, on average go up about 30%. Other than that, though, the life of Donald Trump, the life of Hill Republicans and Hill Democrats really haven't changed that much over the last few weeks. Donald Trump is in Asia. He's going to Mar-a-Lago. He's golfing. He's hosting events at the White House. He's demolishing the East Wing. On Capitol Hill, House Republicans are holding steady with the "we're not coming back until this is figured out." And Democrats are still, at least, being cheered by their base for standing up to Trump and for taking a stand on this shutdown. Before, until any of that shifts, or maybe there's a pressure point that we haven't seen yet that puts pressure on one of those factions to make a change, it does feel like we're going to break a record.
Let me pick up on that, Amicia. I want you to weigh in on this, because Dan's right. It seems as though the bases are saying, keep going, fight on. We haven't seen too many of the independent arbiters weighing in, putting pressure on Republicans or Democrats, but that's until today. Delta Airlines put out a statement that appears to at least be siding with Republicans in the short term. It says Delta Airlines implores Congress to immediately pass a clean continuing resolution to reopen the government so that our air traffic controllers, TSA and CBP officers can get back to work. Could Democrats risk overplaying their hand here? And you know, the Republican argument that we're not asking for anything special. We just want to open up the government and then negotiate.
Well, I think that we have to, again, be mindful of the fact that Republicans are in power of everything. They hold the House, they hold the Senate, they hold the White House, they have the majority in the Supreme Court as well. At the end of the day, the people who have the majority are typically the people who hold the cards when it comes to a shutdown and shutdown negotiations. What I think matters most here, and we saw even in the last government shutdown, which didn't go as long as this one, was that the air traffic controllers and the airlines pretty much held the cards, because once you get close to, particularly around a holiday, and people can't get to their families, then somebody's going to make a deal. That just typically is what it is. But I think that now, when we've got millions of people across the country, red states, blue states, purple states, people who voted for Trump in plus 20 districts, are all on the fringe when it comes to not being able to feed their families this holiday season. We are hearing from parents who are saying, hey, can we get canned goods instead of candy at Trick or Treat, because we need our families to be able to eat. And that matters.
Yeah, of course it matters. But because I cover the shutdown every single day, the thing I find most frustrating about this, and if you guys can both weigh in on it, is everyone agrees the consequences are bad, right? Mm-hmm. Everyone agrees that people with SNAP benefits deserve their SNAP benefits, and we don't want long lines at the airport. The problem is Democrats say it's the Republicans' fault. Republicans say that it's the Democrats' fault. So, Malik, how do we break that impasse? They don't want to talk to each other about this. They don't want to negotiate. We all agree the consequences are bad. It's who's to blame that we haven't figured out yet.
And I think the point that was made about the pressure point, we really haven't seen that, because for one, and I'll just say, I agree with Lindsey Graham, his proposal, his constitutional amendment to basically allow the members of Congress, you will not get paid during the shutdown. I think that actually needs to happen. Will it pass Congress? Of course it will. Government shutdowns are never good. It doesn't matter. I remember during the Obama administration, when it was a government shutdown, then Republicans were blamed for it because they didn't want to play ball. This was around Obamacare. A similar thing is happening now. Yes, Republicans are asking for a clean CR, and that clean CR means that it doesn't have any major policy riders attached to it. The pressure point, though, it's one thing for people to say that it's the federal government. We don't care. They'll get paid eventually. But when people stop, they're not going to get their SNAP benefits.
Right.
That will be the pressure point.
We're going to have to leave it there, guys. Great conversation. Dan, Amisha, Malik, we appreciate you being here. Still to come, aid begins to arrive in Jamaica as the death toll rises following Hurricane Melissa's direct hit to the island nation. We're live in Kingston with the very latest next. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Across the Caribbean, the devastation of Hurricane Melissa is coming into focus. In Jamaica, entire streets and communities have been swept away where the hurricane raged through the island as the most powerful in its history. At least 9 are dead on the island, more than 27 across the Caribbean. Right now, Melissa is making its way north through the Bahamas and Bermuda, where both nations have implemented shelter-in-place warnings. The storm has weakened to sustained winds of up to 105 miles per hour, making it a still very dangerous Category 2 hurricane. Joining me now from Kingston, Jamaica, is NBC News correspondent Jesse Kirsch. Jesse, just tell us about the level of devastation on the ground and what you're seeing right now at the airport.
Yes, Zohran, what we're seeing here is fairly calm. Some of the flights for the day have already left. And I have our photographer, George, come with me. We'll just walk through the terminal here and just give you an idea of what it looks like. So there are people waiting in line to check bags, get tickets. There are also some people who are, you can see, camping out. Unclear if they'll be spending the night here. We know of at least some people who have told us that they're planning to spend the night here because they were lucky enough to get a flight out tomorrow, but they didn't want to risk not being in position for that flight. So that's the scene here at the airport. We know that Kingston, which is, of course, a massive population center here in Jamaica, was largely spared the brunt of this storm. The worst of Melissa was to the west of Kingston. So this major population center and also a major artery for aid to get in was largely untouched by comparison to other parts. And that means that the airport is up and running, both for commercial flights as well as for aid flights to get in. When we landed earlier today, we saw an aid flight on the tarmac. So that process is starting to begin here. And I don't think we yet know the full scale of the destruction across this country because there are still comms issues for people. A woman I met earlier said that she has not been able to talk to her brother since Monday. He is in the Montego Bay area. And so that is something of concern for people here, is trying to figure out if their loved ones are okay. So that is the ongoing process as we continue to get closer to the outer reaches, the hardest hit areas. I know our other team with correspondent George Solis and his team, they are in the western part of the country trying to get an idea of how bad things are over there. But here, it's starting to look like business as usual, with the exception, of course, of aid teams coming in, supplies on the ground. And I think we're going to see Kingston more and more in the days ahead to become something of a staging area for a lot of these groups to get aid to those in need, Ryan.
And then, of course, the hurricane is still making its way up the Atlantic. Bermuda is perhaps its next target. Tell us about the impacts we've seen in other parts of the Caribbean as well.
We know that there were evacuations in parts of Cuba. We know that the Bahamas was possibly going to be dealing with some of this. And as you just mentioned, Bermuda. But I can also tell you, I was actually just in the Bahamas for a completely different assignment in recent weeks and spoke with some folks there earlier today. And they're telling our team that they are potentially going to be sending help here as well. So other other countries in this area, Ryan, also trying to help out with their fellow members of the Caribbean area.
Okay, Jesse Kirsch, thank you for that live from Kingston, Jamaica. We appreciate it. And we'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. And if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press on your local NBC News station. Kristen will have an exclusive interview with California Governor Gavin Newsom. You won't want to miss that. There's more news ahead, though, right now on NBC News Now.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.